Hello, and welcome to the next installment of the GOG's Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access, or IDEA, Commitment Education Program. I'm Dr. Kathleen Moore, Deputy Director at the Stevenson Cancer Center in Oklahoma City and Associate Director of GOG Partners and a gynecologic oncologist from the University of Oklahoma. I'm thrilled to be joined today by my colleagues and friends, Dr. Roisin O'Carroll and Dr. Dana Chase, for today's IDEA commitment discussion focused on protocol design. So I'd like to ask my co-panelists to introduce themselves. Dr. O'Carroll, please start.
Hi, my name is Roisin O'Carroll. Delighted to be here and really to discuss this really important topic. I am a medical oncologist at Sloan Kettering in New York, and I'm the research director for our group, and also I am the section head for solid tumor cell therapy there. I'm delighted to be here.
Wonderful. And Dr. Chase.
Hi, I'm Dana Chase. I am a gynecologic oncologist at UCLA. I am also really excited to talk about protocol design and the IDEA commitment.
All right. Well, the GOG Foundation Incorporated would like to thank our commercial supporters for their support of the GOG's IDEA Commitment Initiative, ImmunoGen, and GSK. And with that, let's get started. We have a lot to discuss. And as I mentioned early on, there's a lot of these segments. This is really focused on protocol design and kind of protocol execution, mainly in the United States. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And we have developed sort of a framework to guide what will be a pretty free-flowing discussion between the three of us that focus on these four buckets. The first is really looking at the barriers, barrier buckets. First is discriminatory enrollment criteria. Then we're going to move on to the actual protocol and what's contained in a protocol that can be an obstacle, trial designs, and then trial exclusivity. And there's some overlap in these, but these are unique kind of barriers that we need to overcome to increase access and equity. So we're going to start the discussion really just around what we call in the industry I&E, inclusion, exclusion, and how these can be unintentionally restrictive and exclusionary to our population. And so I want to just start, I'll ask Dr. O'Carroll to sort of start the conversation, because you've done a lot of work through the NCI in modernizing inclusion and exclusion to try and work against this unintentional exclusivity. But can you talk a little bit about how inclusion exclusion kind of came to be, the problems, and some of your thoughts on how we can do better?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing that's so important is that we know that just the mere participation in a trial, people have looked at those who participated in a trial versus those who didn't. And just the mere fact that somebody participated in a trial already improves their outcomes. So it's so important that these trials are accessible to everybody, and that we're really trying to move away from a focus on exclusion to one of inclusion. So really, when we're designing a trial, the default should be that everybody's included, and then we have to be very clear why we're using particular exclusion criteria. And a lot of these were traditionally put in place to have a homogeneous population where you could study your intervention. And also there was also safety concerns where they were trying to exclude individuals who they thought would be at higher risk of toxicity, or who may not be able to continue with the clinical trial in which the intervention is being studied. So a lot of these unintentionally excluded a lot of our patients. And so there has been great efforts, including the ASCO Friends recommendations that were published about 7 years ago. And that time they focused on really trying to think about, why are we excluding certain patients? So they made a big effort to incorporate patients with more aggressive histology, such as those with brain metastases, and gave some guidance of how you could safely incorporate those patients into clinical trials. Same with patients with HIV or AIDS. Mm-hmm. They tried to address age and comorbidities, and also be very conscious of not just automatically excluding patients with organ dysfunction. So being mindful that our older patients probably have reduced creatinine clearance. And, you know, if your drug isn't really cleared, you have to have a very good justification of why you would exclude a patient with renal impairment. And also something as basic as not excluding patients with another malignancy. So often our patients with ovarian cancer have an endometrial cancer, and those are just not real reasons to exclude a patient. So over the years, there's been big strides made in that regard. The more recent ones in May of 2021, again published by the same group, focused a little bit better on washout period. So for some of our oral agents, the washout period is so short that there's no justification for a 4-week washout. Not excluding con meds, some of our groups particularly maybe would take certain supplements and not just automatically excluding those, but really thinking scientifically, will this particular supplement interfere with the mechanism of action that I propose in my trial? Not excluding patients just on the basis of prior lines of therapy. And then also being very conscious of our laboratory reference ranges. Like, do they truly reflect all the patient population, and are they justified? Because if they're not, such as a patient who has a DVT and is on an oral anticoagulation, there may not be any justification to using an IO or APTT cutoff for that particular drug. So big efforts. And then the other one that's really important, especially to the topic that we're discussing, is, you know, making sure that our criteria don't exclude patients just based on their social status or a history, for example, of psychiatric illness, really making sure that our eligibilities do not impose undue barriers on our patients, so that they can all have an equal chance to participate should they choose in a clinical trial.
Yeah, and so I wish we could like flash up links. I just thought about that, of course, like Captain Hindsight. But I think a lot of people probably don't know, you know, if you haven't designed a trial, especially if you haven't designed a trial really for the NCI, you may not know that these documents exist. But if you just get on Google and type in ASCO NCI Friends document, it'll come up with the document from 2017 and 2021 in a table form. And it really is a helpful guideline for those of you that even write investigator-initiated trials or are proposing clinical trials as to what the language could be to be more inclusive. And so it's a really helpful document that I don't think a lot of people know exists. You know, Dr. Chase, I mean, this document's been around, as Dr. O'Carroll said, since 2017. Have you seen it translated into the trials that you're running in Los Angeles? And how do you know, in your population, which is we all live in unique places with unique demographics, how have you seen these criteria kind of, I don't know, exclude portions of your population?
Yeah, I mean, in my time spent in both Arizona and also here in California, especially in the ovarian cancer patient population, I take care of a lot of older women, which now we call maybe seasoned or just more mature, and maybe not use the older term anymore. But I think there's kind of this unspoken exclusion that maybe we all have when we're meeting a patient about whether or not we think that they could participate in a trial. And then there's the actual written inclusion/exclusion criteria that are barriers specifically for older women to go on trial. So while I think these documents are helpful that organizations like ASCO come up with, I think there's also a bias that's not necessarily a bad bias, where you're met with a patient that might have multiple geographic, cognitive, physical challenges with enrolling on a trial that ASCO guideline or not, exclusion criteria or not, make the physician or the provider particularly biased in terms of wanting to talk to that patient about clinical trial enrollment. So I think for me personally, and maybe the staff and the other physicians that I work with, I think reminding myself to keep an open mind about patients that I think might have a challenge going on a trial, just keep an open mind about reviewing the inclusion/exclusion criteria, talking to the patient about potential difficulties that she might have being on the trial, and keeping an open mind about about allowing her to participate despite some of your bias in terms of her actually being able to comply and complete the study.
Yeah, I think, you know, I was just, as we've talked about this, and we've all like lived in the ASCO NCI Friends document for a long time, but I guess I haven't seen a lot of, I've seen some movement in some of our clinical trials incorporating some of the things, but less uptake of some of the other kind of expanded guidelines, specifically around lines of therapy, which you brought up, Dr. O'Carroll, and washout is a key one. You know, it's so frustrating when you think about recurrent ovarian cancer or recurrent endometrial cancer, even sometimes you do have our patients who have really asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic disease, and they probably like 6 weeks off, you know, or 4 weeks. They're like, great, I'm going to take a break from you. But a lot of times, especially in the resistant setting, you know, they have disease. The last treatment didn't work very well. They have more disease than they started with. They don't feel great. And, you know, you can't, you're like, well, you have to stop your whatever PARP inhibitor for 4 weeks before I can put you on this next thing that might work. You know, I don't know about you, we've lost, patients have just fallen off the cliff during those 4 weeks. And that's a frustrating kind of shell game to play. And it just feels like that, like a shell game, like you're just trying to, you know, placate some eligibility criteria to get them access to an exciting new opportunity. But hopefully we'll see more of this uptake. Go ahead. Yeah.
I recently had an experience with an older seasoned patient where the creatinine clearance would have excluded her, but if you really read the inclusion exclusion criteria, it was creatinine clearance or creatinine level. So as long as she met that creatinine level, she could be eligible. She didn't necessarily have to meet the creatinine clearance recommendation. So like sometimes really reading the criteria carefully, you know, your CRC or your assistant that's helping you with trial enrollment doesn't necessarily always have the maturity that you have to look at the inclusion exclusion criteria. So if you're not careful, you can exclude a patient unintentionally just for not really understanding the written document. That came up recently with a patient.
And I suppose that just shows the point of how we have to be careful how we write them. That, you know, that for somebody in a busy clinic to interpret, and that we're not unintentionally excluding. So, you know, talking about barriers, one of the big ones that is very frustrating is, for example, if there's exclusion criteria that exclude Black patients who have endometrial cancer. So, you know, diabetes and hypertension can be more prevalent in Black patients. And so unintentionally, you might be actually excluding the group that are most likely to be affected by the disease. So just being very careful that we justify our eligibility and that we're really mindful of who this disease is affecting, so that we can make sure then that our inclusion exclusion will reflect the group that we're trying to improve the outcomes for.
That's such a great example that I don't think can be under emphasized or cannot be overemphasized. That, you know, if you have comorbidities that happen amongst all ethnicities, right? Everyone has hypertension, but we do see more hypertension amongst our Black population. And many studies, for whatever reason, will say you cannot have, you know, more than 2 medications or you're excluded. Well, most people are treated on a combination medication as 1 medication, but it counts as 2 by most CROs and sponsors. And if they're on that plus hydrochlorothiazide, they're excluded. And their blood pressure is under great control, but they're on, you know, more than 2 medications because they're on 3. So, I mean, just things like that just get silly, you know, and then we've excluded someone, or then you're forced, and have I done this? Yes, I have. I stop. I'm like, well, let's just stop your hydrochlorothiazide then. So you're only on 2. So I can put you on, and then I can add something later. Like, you play these shell games to try and get people access, but I don't know if that's a good thing to do or not, but I really try to be aggressive about getting my patients access to medications. But if you have a CRC that's not, or a research coordinator, you know, they're not going to be thinking that, like, well, I can, or to your point about the anticoagulation, like, how many times have you stopped someone's anticoagulation so they could access a clinical trial because their clot was a long time ago, and you otherwise would keep them on long-term anticoagulation, but you're like, well, let's just stop it and see, because I have this thing for you. I mean, you play these shell games with patients' lives that are unnecessary, to try and help them access medicines.
The other big
Yeah.
example of is, say, cervical cancer, in terms of often these patients are not necessarily English speaking. So we have to be very mindful not to restrict the language in our protocols as well. And I think we talked a little bit about sometimes your patient-reported outcomes are only available in certain languages. And so you may unintentionally exclude a patient population that really is greatly affected by that particular disease. So, you know, all these are barriers, but there are things that we can do to improve them. I think there are great efforts being made, but we have to really truly think about who the patient is, and then how can we best design our protocols around them, rather than designing our protocols and how do the patients fit into it.
Right. We'll talk about that. Let's move. We could probably spend all 30 minutes on this first bucket, but let's move to the second barrier bucket, which is kind of the protocol itself. Like when you're consenting a patient, I think, you know, I'm gonna call you Roisin because we're friends. Roisin and I work a lot in phase 1. Dana, you work a lot probably in phase 1, but mostly late phase. You sit with a patient, talking to them about a clinical trial. I sit there with a sample calendar with my research nurse, and we kind of give them an idea of what it will look like to be on this particular clinical trial, number of days, hours spent here, CTs, the labs, the PKs that go in phase 1, but even late phase sometimes are quite complicated. There's a lot that goes into a trial in addition to the treatment. So how, I'm going to start with you, Dana. How does the kind of we call the SOE, the schedule of events, how does that impact accessibility of clinical trials to an appropriate expanded population?
I recently had this come up with a patient going on a phase 3 trial. And, you know, when you're in a large urban setting, or even if you're in a smaller, kind of more rural setting, typically you're having patients drive a long time to get to the site that has the trial open. And so really, I think something that would help tremendously in getting patients that aren't living right close, you know, close by the actual clinical trial site is allowing for telemedicine visits, especially if you don't have to do a pelvic exam. Obviously, being able to do a telemedicine visit would be very, very helpful in encouraging patients that this trial could be doable for them. I think also central labs can be a big problem for patients that have a long drive to the clinical trial site, and shipping medication also. I mean, I think anything that can limit the patient's need to get in a car and drive a couple hours. In an older patient population, sometimes they need somebody to actually drive them, and so that's also a barrier for a patient that has physical or visual limitations. So I think really thinking about how we can include patients that don't live a block away from the clinical trial site would be helpful to enroll patients that are really not seen very frequently on clinical trials, like certain ethnic or racial populations, and definitely older patients that live in some of these retirement communities that are pretty far from the actual clinical trial office.
Yeah, or rural populations.
Yes.
You know,
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And urban populations, we have people that need to work because insurance is dependent on them having a job. So it's hard for them to spend 8 hours in the chair because we have to do a bunch of PKs. So Dr. Roisin, what are your thoughts on the protocol?
I mean, to that point of those who work, like, you know, more flexible hours, allowing maybe that they do their telemed before they come and pick up their community participation. So moving away from just conducting clinical trials in large academic centers and really doing everything to facilitate community trial participation, engaging in the groups locally and seeing what's important, what are the barriers that will be there, not only perceived by the study team, but also by the patients. So involving patient advocates really early. on. I think another way is trying to omit, unnecessary testing. Maybe you're very stringent in your phase 1, but as you move and the trial evolves and it's very clear, for example, that there isn't any cardiac toxicity, maybe omitting those kind of testing later in the development of the drug, increasing the intervals between the protocol visits. And then for the study team, what about centralizing the research administration tasks so that that's not necessarily a burden on a community practice, that a lot of that could be centralized?
Yep. Yeah, I think this is a big place. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Dina.
I will just add that some of our, especially in the gynecologic cancer world, some of our cancer types are not very common. And so to open clinical trials offices at some of these satellite sites to enroll one patient here or one patient there is not feasible financially or with staff being limited. So being able to enroll patients at satellite sites where the clinical trials office is a more central site would be really helpful for some of these rare tumors.
Yeah, even for not, I mean, I think COVID was terrible in every way. And it forced us to innovate. And it showed us we can decentralize trials to a great degree and really forced us to strip away a lot of the things. I've heard Dr. Pazner talk about, like all the ornaments that people keep trying to hang on the studies. I'm gonna add this, I'm gonna add this, I'm gonna add this. And they're nice, but you don't really need to get your answer. And so if you really want to bring things to the community and decentralize, like power it for the important question, strip it back to be safe, but accessible, run these studies. And Project Pragmatica, which is, I know this is a gynecologic session, but this is a big lung study, is a big example of it. It's just 2 commercially available regimens for recurrent lung cancer that anyone can access wherever they are, their standard of care. You give them the way you want to, it's randomized, and the outcome is overall survival. That's what they're collecting. And it can be open anywhere. And we can't do all studies like that, but we could do a lot.
And to your point, I think COVID also made us realize that you don't necessarily need to do a placebo trial. I mean, during COVID, we could not justify patients coming in for placebo injections. So a lot of the studies were modified. And here we are, we have a readout from studies that were able to omit the placebo. So, I think those are things that maybe we thought weren't possible, but we realize are, and they're much better for the patient. It's great when the patient knows exactly what treatment they're assigned to. I think it makes us all feel a lot more comfortable. And if it doesn't sacrifice our study endpoints, then, we really need to fully support that and embrace it.
Right. Agree. Okay, let's move on to our next barrier bucket, which is a little different than the kind of overlapping, but a little different than the specifics, the granular details of the trial protocol. Is really how we design and how we think about trial design in a more holistic way, from phase 1 to phase 3. Like, how do we really rethink accessibility to these studies and making sure the populations who are at the highest risk of the incidence of getting and dying from our cancers actually have access at equivalent ratios to the studies, and it can't just be all developed in white people and then we roll it out and there's no data in any other population, which is kind of what happens a lot in the US. So how do we get there? I'm going to advance this one because I think we have a little graphic. Yeah. How do we called this adaptive design goals. How do we get here? I'll start with the other of you.
I mean, I think pre-planning, thinking ahead, like don't just think about where we are in the phase 1, but planning ahead for the phase 3, and being able to identify the group. So for example, if I'm studying endometrial cancer, I absolutely want to make sure that I am enrolling patients, a Black population, that I am including the group that, say, with certain biomarkers like cyclin E might be amplification, and making sure that I am studying my intervention in the group that are most likely to derive benefit or who will reflect the real world population. And then looking at dose optimization, we know that, just because we get to a maximum tolerated dose, that's not necessarily the dose that is needed to treat our patients effectively. So really trying to tease that out. And there's the Project Project Optimus in that regard, and all the clinical trials now are really trying to incorporate that kind of thought process much earlier. Being nimble, so if we see a signal in a particular group or a particular biomarker, being able to do an expansion cohort. And then, of course, as we discussed before, including our patients really early on in the design and what's important to the patient, and making sure that when we finish our study that we will have been able to address those. It's often it's awful to wait until the very end to get the patient input. It really needs to be incorporated from the get-go.
Yeah,
Yeah,
agree.
I mean,
Dr. Chase, yeah.
Oh, I'll just add that, you know, in our recurrent ovary trials, a lot of recurrent ovary patients are over 70. And I think this idea of dose optimization is, patient input is very important in an older patient population, and especially in the recurrent ovary trials, understanding dosing in older women and optimizing that dosing to limit certain toxicities that older women might be more prone to, like neuropathy or kidney dysfunction. And then also really understanding in a woman who's 85, for example, what her goals of care are, and what that trial should bring that older woman. Like, how do you convince her to go on trial because it will help her to achieve what her goals of care are? I think is really important.
Yeah.
And so let's move on to the last, and probably one of the most exciting things to think about. This is sort of thinking outside the box, is what we've termed trial exclusivity. You know, right now, patients can only access trials where the trials are open. And trials may be open, you know, there's certain trials that are only open at 30 sites in the United States or 15 sites in the United States. Or even 60 sites. It's not that many sites. And they tend to be at the same sites that we all know and love. And that's very exclusive. That in of itself is exclusionary to the vast majority of our patients with gynecologic malignancies that have no or little access, you know, to those trial sites. And so it unintentionally or intentionally skews the populations who have access to trials. And so we wanted to really talk about this sort of idea. We use the word kind of hierarchical trial design and hierarchical testing to talk about this thought idea. But why don't I have Dr. O'Carroll start about kind of how we might think trials in the future, truly equitable trials. What could that look like?
Well, I think there's a great opportunity in this kind of hierarchical testing is what we're calling it. So we have our intent to treat population that maybe will have the restricted eligibility. They may not permit organ impairment, but then making sure that at the same time that you have a broader population that really reflects the real world, so that you can do your primary analysis in the intent to treat population with their very restricted eligibility, but at the same time you are allowing real world data to be acquired during the time that the study is being conducted. Historically, we do the trial, we get the result, and then we treat the real world population, and it just doesn't work that well. You know, it just doesn't give us the same opportunities to learn as much, and perhaps even not to get safety signals as quickly. And then also unintentionally, we often are excluding, in GYN cancers, we often exclude our platinum refractory patients, those with the most aggressive histology, those with carcinosarcoma, those with brain metastases. And these are really important because these are the patients who are most likely to develop progressive or recurrent disease. And they're probably the most in need of better treatment options. So I think being very thoughtful and automatically having this idea that we will have a very inclusive patient population, but then we can focus our primary endpoints if we want in a smaller population.
Yeah, so maybe having sites that are activated with all the bells and whistles, I would use that term, all the things, all the support. And then you have, I don't really call them second tier sites because that implies a value, but just an outer ring, a ring of study sites that aren't doing the PKs, and they're not doing the food effect study, and they're not doing the, you know, X-ray, this and that, but they're following safety and they have access to the medication. and they're getting the CT scans and they can follow the protocol, which is a lot of our sites are quite capable of doing that if we provided some central regulatory support. And that would vastly broaden access to trials and provide probably better efficacy and safety data.
Yeah, and we've all screened patients where you're going through the screening process and at the last minute they're not, you know, they don't meet all the eligibility criteria. So this is also an opportunity. Maybe that patient could still be tested on the study, but maybe in a single arm cohort of an expanded eligibility, so less restrictive. And I would love that idea, just because some of these white cells come back at, you know, or the neutrophils come back at 1.4, that patient still could go on the study intervention, and you know, for the and not just for an arbitrary exclusion criteria.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that, you know, in terms of this point about aggressive tumor biology, it's always a challenge when you get an FDA approval or a new NCCN guideline that allows you to use a certain drug in a certain patient population, but then in your real world situation, you have a carcinosarcoma or a platinum refractory patient, or a patient with a partial SBO due to carcinomatosis. And none of those patients would have been eligible to go on trial. So you're really wondering what's like the risk benefit ratio of using this new exciting drug on this patient with a partial SBO that desires more treatment and understands the potential risk benefit. And you just have no way of telling her with your partial SBO whether or not she's going to gain benefit from the drug. So I love this idea of expanding eligibility once you have that first patient population established. I think it will give us a lot of kind of real world data that we really need to talk to the patient about whether or not this is an appropriate medication for her clinical situation.
It's almost like, I don't know how you do this statistically. We'd have, that's beyond the time constraints we have, but it's almost like you're moving like what we call phase 4 testing, like into the phase 3 in a tiered sort of way. Like once you know you have interim analyses showing that you're not doing something harmful, just sort of Project Frontrunner, like moving it up the phase 4 so you can expand eligibility and not wait, and then be surprised later that you see things that you wish you had known earlier.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a thing when we're, you know, there's a new standard of care, and this is the first time it's been that I'm aware that it's been used in somebody with, we'll say, brain metastases, and what should I do? You know, those kind of, like, you're using your best guess, whereas this approach, you actually would have data and you're not using your best guess. You know, it's a more concerted and definitely much better in terms of increasing our knowledge and being able to share that knowledge widely.
Yeah. So I'm gonna, as I thought we're gonna run out of time, but I wanted to make sure this is actually probably one of the more important topics, and as usual, we're not going to spend enough time on it. But Roisin, you've really brought this, you say this often, and I think we all say this, but we don't yet put it into action. We're starting to, is really keeping the patient voice at center. We all care about our patients. Like, that's why we're here. It's why we work so hard to educate one another and develop medicines so that patients live longer. Patients are at the center, 100%. Patient voice in informing how we design studies and what studies roll out and how we prioritize endpoints has not really been the priority. I think I'm just going to acknowledge, as a drug developer, it's not been the priority that it should, but I think it's gaining appropriately in traction, it being a key component from the beginning, you know, of how we design and execute clinical trials globally, but we're talking about the US. Can you both give me a little perspective, pardon me, on some of these components of patient involvement?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big change has been the excellent patient advocate groups that we have. One that comes to mind is ICANA, you know, really making us be focused and realizing, yeah, of course the patient needs to be at the center. And it's not just merely a copy forward. I'm definitely guilty of copying forward eligibility, but really stopping and thinking, what's my trial? How will it benefit the patient? And starting from that point, not starting from the protocol that I used before, but truly putting the patient at the center, in engaging with our patient advocates, and getting the patient perspective from the get-go before we even do the phase 1, and not waiting until the end. And I think that's what all these 4 kind of buckets really focus on is, you know, in every step of the way, from the initial conversation with the patient in terms of the informed consent, making sure that it is legible, that they, you know, it's that it makes sense to them, creating other documents, not just the paper informed consent, but really patient education resources so that they truly understand in a very patient friendly manner what the goal of the clinical trial is and what the hope is and how it might benefit them. And then, as I said, engaging from the beginning with our patient advocates, our community groups as well. And then there's been new initiatives. Last February, the SGO launched, as in 2023, the SGO launched the PROMOTE study, which is a patient-reported outcomes measurement opportunities through equity. And the goal here was to develop new patient-reported outcomes for patients with endometrial cancer by getting contemporary measures of what truly is meaningful to the patient, but also to us as their treating doctors, and trying to use those, develop those tools, and then validate them. So really a return of value, which is the last bucket, to the patient, you know, making sure that at the end of participation in the study that we truly are giving the patients back what they want. We talked, I think, a little bit about blinding or not blinding, but, you know, a lot of the patients often want to know exactly what treatment group they were assigned to. Simple things like sitting with them afterwards and sharing the published document. That's something I love doing, is giving a manuscript back to the patient who participated in the trial. There's been new initiatives to do patient-friendly versions. So that was the best ever, was giving back to the patient who participated in a trial, went to huge efforts to, you know, keep up with all her visits. And it was lovely to hand her back a document that was written in a very patient-friendly manner. And I think that kind of return of value is priceless.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And Dr. Chase.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things. I think the FDA and the pharmaceutical company have certain metrics that they're trying to follow, or certain rules about what the pharmaceutical company needs to include in their trial, and then what the FDA will look at and ultimately give approval of the drug. But I do believe that still, to this day, the patient's goals with that treatment are not always known or listened to. And the problem is, or the challenge is, that different patient groups have different goals. So it's not like one endpoint fits all. Although the FDA pharmaceutical company choose an endpoint that they think applies to all patient groups, there's definitely different endpoints for different groups that are important. And that's obviously a challenge, but something that hopefully will be incorporated more in trial design and considered by the FDA and the pharmaceutical company. And I think one way that could be helped is by increasing patient advocates throughout the entire process. And then I will just say, kind of that last bullet point on the return of value, connections with others in a study. I think sometimes a patient can feel pretty isolated in her trial enrollment process, and being able to get a buddy at not just maybe at the site she's at, but also maybe at a different site, potentially in another state, maybe helps the patient to understand and to trust the clinical trial process. But otherwise, I think there's multiple areas that are being worked on and hopefully will help.
Yeah, I think this is, maybe we should have led with this. I think this is such an important slide, and everything you both said brings a lot of value. One of the new initiatives, just to point out, to make sure everyone knows that the FDA is mandated, which is wonderful, is that these big phase 3 trials, and I think they may even want it for randomized phase 2s, come in with what's called a diversity plan. And for the GOG partners, Dr. Bhavana Pothuri leads that. Within the NRG, we pay very close attention. There's actually some kind of diversity chairs we have on some of our key trials to make sure we're watching key demographics. We're very different, though, because the NRG can open so broadly that there's a lot more access to clinical trials. And if you look at least with our cervical cancer work, we have done an amazing job at enrolling very diverse populations, and in endometrial, because there's not limits to the number of sites. But we are paying much more attention up front to the strategies to make sure the trial is designed in such a way that it will be accessible to the populations, again, at risk of developing and dying from the cancer, rather than reacting to the fact that you finish a study and there's only 6% Black women on an endometrial trial. And then you're like, well, what am I going to do about that? That's a problem, but you can't fix it at that point unless you just reopen. So there is a lot of intentional work being done to strategize and do a lot of the innovations that you've heard us discuss throughout this talk up front, and then real time follow it. So that if you're not meeting metrics and you're a quarter of the way through, you got to pivot. Because I think, and I'm proud of the FDA, I think if you bring in another study in endometrial cancer or even ovary cancer that does not have a representative demographic of the US, they are probably going to ask you to, come back to Dallas, as we like to say about GOG boards, but which I think they should. Like, we should be held to the standard, and so I think we're finally getting there. And we just can't say enough about how proud we are of the ICANA network and their community advocacy and really not even patient-centered, it's patient-centered, but it's community-centered advocacy around early detection and creating a community for patients that have been long excluded from having a voice. So it's just, if you don't know about ICANA, I would encourage you to look at the Endometrial Cancer Action Network for African Americans, ICANAwomen.org. It's a model for how we should be doing community advocacy across groups in gynecologic cancers. And Dr. Kemi Dahl should be have a statue erected. She's just done an amazing job. So we're gonna kind of finish up. This is just sort of our wrap up. So these are the 4, I called them barrier buckets that we talked about today. And I just would like to ask Roshina and Dana just to comment on, if you're there's a bunch of people listening to this, some develop trials, some participate in trials, some are thinking about it. And maybe we have patients listening and other stakeholders. What do you think are because it sounds overwhelming. Like, what do you think are one thing that someone that's boots on the ground, maybe has trials open or thinking about opening trials, what's something they can do to sort of take the blinders off to things we do unintentionally or we agree to do unintentionally that make a more exclusive environment? And then what do you think the most impactful thing will be we can do from a kind of higher level? And then we'll close.
Yeah. Well, one thing I think we can all do is when we're talking with our pharma colleagues is, what is our diversity plan? How are we going to be inclusive? How are we going to incorporate the patient voice? And it's actually really refreshing to see in those discussions, the company pause and say, wow, that is important to you. Tell me a little bit more. And then, I've sent all the ASCO, I've emailed several times, having these resources to hand and being able to send them and say, hey, this is actually, agreed guidance. And this is, our patients really do appreciate that. And we as investigators also are very committed to that. And, if you don't change your inclusion, exclusion criteria, I'm not sure that our site can participate because we feel that it won't be to the benefit of everybody. So having those conversations up front, that's something all of us can do. Even with the monitoring visits, I had a monitoring visit for with a really great group, and they also were very receptive to feedback because one of their questions was exclusionary based on what they were asking me. And I was like, well, you actually shouldn't be asking me that. That's not something that we should be excluding our patients for. So it was great that that person said they'd take it back to the company and also make sure that they're making big efforts not to have any kind of exclusionary, unintentionally exclusionary language in their protocols.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think I would just encourage people that are watching to keep an open mind about putting patients on trial or trying to put patients on trial, and try to give everybody a fair chance. I know we all, myself included, are always trying to be fair, but I know including in my own personal practice that some feelings about putting a patient on trial kind of cross your mind just because it might be a challenge for multiple different reasons. So I know it takes extra time, takes extra coordination with the research staff, the research staff sometimes has to contact the monitor and ask about travel vouchers and ask about certain, clarifying certain inclusion exclusion criteria. But I would just encourage you to take the time to get these patients on trial that are not traditionally included. It takes extra time, extra effort, extra staff time and effort, but sometimes they're more they are actually allowed to enroll. It's just an extra effort, but very meaningful in the end. Will be very meaningful in the end.
Well, great. Well, with that, I think we will end our discussion for today. And I would like to just say this concludes our program. I'd like to thank Doctors O'Carroll and Chase, Roshina and Dana. It's hard to, I know I flip back and forth. It's hard to not refer to because we're all friends. But thank you guys for spending time with me this morning and for being a part of this very important program. For those of you watching, I hope you found this informative. Please see this slide, and there is a website where you can sort of get more information on the IDEA Commitment Initiative. And certainly if you have questions or want to be involved, then we would love to have you reach out. Thank you for joining.